On certain nights in 16th century Tuscany, a convent in Prato would fall strangely still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sisters would pause in the corridor, listening, and then it would begin. A young nun, hidden behind the grille, trembling with a sorrow not her own, as though the Passion of Christ were unfolding again, hour by hour, inside her living body. Her name in the world had been Alessandra de Ricci, born in Florence in 1522 to a noble family with polished manners and heavy expectations. But the child who should have learned to rule salons and estates seemed drawn instead to silence, prayer, and the wounded love of Jesus. Her mother died when she was young, and the ache of that absence carved a deeper space in her heart, space that, over time, became a kind of doorway. Sent to be educated among Benedictine sisters at Monticelli, Alessandra was exposed to the rhythms of sacred life: bells, psalms, candlelight, and the strange sweetness of renunciation. While others saw restriction, she sensed freedom. Something in her responded to the idea that a life could be offered whole and unbroken to God. When she was 14, her family attempted to arrange a suitable future, but Alessandra's will had already chosen its direction. She entered the Dominican monastery of San Vincenzo in Prato and took a new name, Catherine de Ricci. It was not a romantic escape, it was a surrender, and it would cost her more than she could imagine. The convent was not a stage for miracles, it was a place of ordinary demands: obedience, chores, community tensions, fatigue. Catherine was not spared those. In fact, her early years were marked by illness and trials that tested her resolve. Yet those who watched her closely noticed something steady beneath the struggle, an interior flame, quiet but stubborn, as if she were learning to breathe with another heart. She prayed with a particular intensity before the crucifix, not as a symbol, not as an idea, but as a reality, love wounded for the sake of the world. And slowly, without spectacle, Catherine's life began to tilt toward a mystery that would soon shake the entire city of Prato. Because the question was coming, one that still unsettles the careful and the skeptical alike. What happens when a human life becomes so open to Christ that his suffering leaves marks? In 1542, Catherine was 20 years old. She had lived in the monastery long enough to be known, enough to be trusted, enough to be ordinary. And then the ordinary broke open. It started quietly, the way storms do when they gather behind the horizon. Catherine would fall into prayer and become unresponsive, her face changing as if she were watching something no one else could see. The sisters were frightened at first. Some wondered if it was illness, some suspected imagination. Others, more cautious, simply watched. Then the pattern emerged. Each week, as Thursday turned toward night, Catherine would enter a profound state that witnesses described as ecstasy. Over many hours, she appeared to relive the Passion of Christ, moving through sorrow, agony, and a love so intense it seemed to crush her. By Friday, she bore visible wounds, marks on hands and feet, signs of the crown of thorns, traces of scourging. Stigmata. In a century shaped by reform and counter-reform, the Church did not treat such reports lightly. Investigations began. Clergy visited, physicians examined, skeptics pressed close, looking for trickery. And yet, again and again, the accounts returned to the same strange conclusion. There was no clear deceit to expose. Catherine herself did not seek attention. She did not present a theory. She offered no performance. When questioned, she answered with humility and restraint, emphasizing not herself, but Christ. What mattered, she believed, was not the marvel, but the meaning. The suffering love of God offered for sinners, calling hearts back to mercy. For 12 years, the weekly cycle continued. Imagine the weight of that. To live inside a community, to carry duties, to be bound by obedience, and to know that every week a new descent awaited you, like a cross you could not refuse. Catherine did not ask for it. She simply endured it, and, more mysteriously, she loved within it. But the deepest drama was not the wounds. The deepest drama was what the wounds did to everyone around her. Because when a community must decide whether it is witnessing holiness or deception, the stakes are spiritual and human. Trust fractures, fear spreads, jealousy wakes up, compassion fights suspicion. And Catherine, silent, enclosed, became the center of a storm she never invited. Yet even in that storm, there were hints of another kind of power, the power of peace. Those who met her spoke of a gravity that did not demand belief, but somehow drew the heart to prayer. It was as if her suffering was not an end in itself, but a message, wordless, relentless. Love is real, sin is real, and Christ is not far. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the visible signs started to fade, leaving behind something less dramatic, but far more difficult to imitate. A long fidelity lived in hiddenness. When the visible stigmata diminished, some assumed the story would fade with them. But Catherine de' Ricci was not a wonder meant to burn quickly and disappear. The extraordinary had not replaced the ordinary. It had purified it. Inside the cloister, Catherine became a woman of steady depth, prayer rooted in reality, obedience without bitterness, discipline without coldness. The sisters who once watched her with anxious curiosity now saw a different miracle, a life that did not collapse under attention, judgment, or spiritual intensity. Her reputation spread beyond Prato. Letters arrived, carefully folded, carried by messengers, addressed to a nun who would never step beyond the monastery walls. Noble families asked for counsel, clergy asked for prayers. Those in spiritual confusion asked for clarity, and Catherine answered, not with the tone of a visionary enthralled by her own experiences, but with the voice of someone who knew the fragile terrain of the human soul. Her correspondence reveals a grounded spiritual intelligence, focused on humility, confession, charity, and perseverance. She warned against pride disguised as devotion. She insisted on the reality of temptation. She spoke of grace not as a concept, but as a lifeline. Among those connected to her was Philip Neri in Rome, a man known for joy, reform, and a fearless love for souls. That connection matters because it places Catherine in a wider movement, the Church, bruised and contested, striving for renewal from within. And yet, Catherine's influence did not come from travel, titles, or public speeches. It came from enclosure, from constancy, from the slow labor of becoming holy when no applause is available. This is where the story becomes sharper, because mystical episodes can dazzle, but a life of steady virtue exposes us. It asks whether we want holiness only when it feels dramatic, or whether we will pursue it in dishes, silence, irritation, fatigue, misunderstood motives, and the daily friction of community life. Catherine lived that friction for decades. She carried responsibilities in the monastery. She navigated personalities and conflicts. She faced moments where devotion felt dry and prayer felt heavy. And still she returned, again and again, to the same center: Christ crucified and Christ present. The world outside the walls was loud: political shifts, religious controversy, plague fears, and the constant human hunger for certainty. Inside the monastery, Catherine offered something more difficult than certainty: surrender. But surrender did not make her weak, it made her capable of leadership. And that leadership would become one of the strongest signs that her sanctity was not a passing intensity, but a formed character, tested not only by ecstasy, but by administration, patience, and the daily demand to love real people. Because soon, Catherine would be placed in a role that requires a saint to be more than a mystic. She would be asked to become a mother. In time, Catherine de' Ricci was chosen as prioress of her monastery. It is one thing to inspire from a distance, it is another to govern. A prioress must manage resources, discipline, schedules, relationships, and crises. She must correct without crushing. She must encourage without indulging. She must keep a community unified when personalities pull it apart. For many, leadership is where spiritual ideals fracture. For Catherine, leadership became another altar. Accounts describe her as calm, attentive, and firm, remarkably balanced for someone associated with extraordinary mystical experiences. She was not carried away by visions, she was anchored by responsibility. She expected seriousness from her sisters, but she also understood weakness. Her holiness was not sentimental, it was practical. People continued to seek her counsel, but she guarded the cloister's integrity. Her mission was to form a community where prayer was not a private hobby, but a shared life. She insisted that contemplation must feed charity, otherwise it becomes self-absorption. Catherine's spiritual emphasis remained centered on the Passion, not as a fascination with pain, but as a school of love. She taught, by example, that suffering can be joined to Christ for the sake of others, not in a way that glorifies misery, but in a way that refuses to waste it. And in those years, the monastery of San Vincenzo became known not simply as a place where a stigmatic lived, but as a place where prayer was intense and reform was real. This is often overlooked. Saints do not only endure, they build. They leave behind a pattern of life that others can step into. Catherine shaped a community that outlived her fame. Her health declined gradually in old age, but her spirit did not narrow. She continued to intercede, to advise, to suffer quietly, and to anchor her sisters in hope. She had seen the fragility of bodies, her own included. She had seen the fragility of reputations. She had seen how quickly the world's attention changes. So she chose what does not change: Christ. When Catherine died on February 2nd, 1590, the city of Prato did not feel that a curiosity had ended. It felt that a light had gone out. But the Church does not canonize emotion. It investigates, it tests, it weighs evidence and witness. Over time, Catherine's life was examined with care. Her virtues, her writings, the testimonies of those who knew her, and the spiritual fruit that continued after her death. Centuries later, she would be beatified in 1732 and canonized in 1746. And her memory would endure, not as a strange tale, but as a living question for every believer. What if holiness is not reserved for the spectacular, but is forged in hidden fidelity? Because the truest legacy of Catherine de' Ricci is not the mystery of wounds. It is the mystery of love that refuses to close. Today, when people speak of Catherine de' Ricci, they often begin with the startling elements: ecstasies, visions, stigmata. And yes, those are part of her story. But if we stop there, we misunderstand her. Catherine did not ask God for phenomena. She asked for Jesus. And when God answered, the answer was not comfort, it was union shaped like a cross. Her life offers a hard truth that modern hearts resist. We can admire the crucified from a distance, but Catherine teaches that love wants closeness, not a closeness of sentiment, but of surrender, where faith is proved in patience, where prayer persists without reward, where obedience is chosen even when misunderstood. She also offers another truth, quieter but just as strong. Holiness is not fragile. If Catherine's faith had been only emotion, it would have shattered under scrutiny. If it had been only imagination, it would have dissolved with time. If it had been only spectacle, it would have left nothing behind. But her sanctity showed itself in what remained: humility, stability, charity, wise counsel, and a life that made others want God more than they wanted comfort. Her feast is kept on February 13th. Year after year, the Church places her before us, not to entertain, but to awaken. Because Catherine de' Ricci stands as a witness that suffering can be transformed, not by denial, not by bitterness, but by offering. And she challenges us to ask, what in my life could become prayer if I stopped clenching it in fear? Perhaps your burdens are not dramatic. Perhaps your wounds are hidden. Perhaps your sacrifices look small, repetitive, ordinary, like a life inside a convent where nobody applauds. Catherine would understand that. She would tell you, in the language of her own choices, that the place where you are faithful today can become the place where grace is loudest. That Christ is not only found in moments of light, but in the long corridors of endurance. And if we dare to take her seriously, her story becomes a spiritual invitation. Do not waste suffering. Do not waste silence. Do not waste the ordinary day. Bring it to the crucified, who does not despise the weak, who does not abandon the tired, who does not turn away from the sinner. Every saint has a story, and Catherine de' Ricci's story whispers this final line like a candle in the dark. Holiness is possible because Christ is near.